This is episode 407 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Catherine Roberts-Parker and I'm a PhD candidate in Shakespeare Studies at the University of Sydney. I'm currently writing a thesis titled Words and Music, a study of the cultural significance of ballad singing in Elizabethan and Jacobean comedy. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
Today I want to talk with you about one of the contemporaries from the life of William Shakespeare who changed the entire course of diplomacy for Europe with his decisions. This man was named Henry Wotton. Henry was King James's ambassador to Venice in the 1600s. And at grammar school, he studied the same subjects as William Shakespeare, but unlike Shakespeare, Henry went on to study at university. There, he was tutored by a man named Alberico Gentili, a man who was at the time publishing essentially the handbook on international diplomacy. After graduation, Henry Wotton spent 5 years traveling across Europe, stacking up experience that gained him employment. And after he finished his 5-year tour, he returned to England and was appointed personal secretary to Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. Now, you'll remember Essex from the Essex Rebellion that took place there and cost Robert Devereux his own life. The connections to Devereux at that time meant that Wotton had to flee England, but a chance encounter would bring Wotton to the attention of King James. And right at the moment King James was ascending to the English throne, he would call Henry Wotton from exile and appoint him ambassador to Venice. This extraordinary tale of Sir Henry Wotton is the feature story in our guest's latest book. We are delighted to welcome Carol Chillington-Rudder to the show today. She is author of Lying Abroad, Henry Wotton and the Invention of Diplomacy. She joins us to share the remarkable story of Henry Wotton, a man whose real-life adventures in diplomacy were unfolding even as Shakespeare was staging characters like ambassadors on the London stage and setting some of his plays amid the politics of Venice where Wotton was working. In her book, Dr. Rudder explores the extraordinary life of the man King James called his honest dissembler. Henry was considered a maverick diplomat who fled England in disgrace, only to return and redefine the very art of diplomacy in ways that still influence international relations today. Before we dive into our conversation, I want to remind you that you can browse through visual history related to our conversation while you're listening to the show. These are available inside our detailed show notes for members of That Shakespeare Life. The notes this week include primary documents, period portraits, woodcuts, museum artifacts, and other visual content related to the life of Henry Wotton and English diplomacy abroad during Shakespeare's lifetime. You can view these extras while you listen right now at CassidyCash.com/episode 407. You will click access the extras to sign in and explore all the bonus content. Again, that's CassidyCash.com/EP407. And now, back to the show. Hello, Carol. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Thank you for having me, Cassidy. It's a pleasure to be here.
Henry took his BA from Queen's College, Oxford in June of 1588. Was he already set on a career in diplomacy at that time, or how did his education prepare him for his career?
Well, you've already referred to the fact that Wotton and Shakespeare had the same kind of humanist education at grammar school. And grammar school was there positioned to train boys in Latin. And Latin, of course, is the early modern internet. So if you could learn and speak Latin, you could communicate across Europe. You could read the books that all of Europe was reading. You could speak a language and you could write that language so that everybody could understand you. But Shakespeare, of course, didn't go to university. Henry Wotton went on to university. So he and Shakespeare were reading Cicero, Ovid, Tacitus, and so on, Virgil at school. Wotton then went on to university where he would have had the higher diploma in those same sources. But he would have also learned more about rhetoric, logic, and particularly disputation. Disputation is about argument, how you form an argument. And they did this by a process of having two disputants stand on their feet and argue a point in Latin. And the point, of course, was to win the argument. Now, that is precisely the kind of legalistic training that an ambassador would have needed, to be able to marshal language, but also to refer to past events, to use quotation, and eventually just kind of beat your opponent into a rhetorical pulp. But he didn't have a career in sight. More importantly, I think what happened to him at university was that he came in contact with a person who was able to set him on that course. And that was a man called Alberico Gentili, who was, at the moment that Wotton was at Oxford, writing the first systematic account of international diplomacy. He was a rhetorician, but he was also an expert in what was called the Jus Gentium, the law of international relations, so international law. And that book, I think, probably was put on Wotton's reading list and helped him understand what was the process of an ambassador, what was the qualities of the ambassador, and what he might be doing as an ambassador. All of those young men who went up to university in the time of Wotton were involved in secular careers, going on to see how they might serve the government and what we might think of today as a civil service.
Henry traveled abroad for 5 years, finally returning to England in late 1594. Do we know why did he return instead of just staying gone? And then how did we bridge that to becoming Robert Devereux's personal private secretary? I mean, that's a pretty high-ranking position.
Well, you need to remember that date, June 1588, when he graduated. That was the year of the Armada. And all the youth of England were on fire to act against what was seen as the Catholic threat of Spain invading Europe. But once that threat was temporarily drowned in the North Sea, what a young man like Wotton needed to do was, after university, gain real experience in the real world. So the notion was that as you were reading books, now you need to read the world. So he traveled for these 5 years, going from the north of what we now think of as Germany, through Austria, Italy, into Venice, just for 4 days the first time. He was traveling, we need to remember also, going back to that date, 1588, he was traveling as a Protestant across mainly Catholic Europe, where to be a Protestant is still very much a dangerous profession. He could have been caught by the Inquisition. He made a hair-raising trip to Rome, traveling incognito under, he said, a mighty blue feather in his hat, so that everybody would look at him and know that he couldn't possibly be an Englishman, or couldn't possibly be somebody who didn't want to be known. But he had escapades like that as a traveler that were all about gaining experience, seeing towns, peoples, different ideas, different costumes, different money, storing all of that up to be used for a future occupation in England. Because, of course, not only was traveling dangerous and expensive for a young man, it was also directed to coming home, to becoming useful to a patron, to the state, to the government, but to seek employment. Now that he had all of this experience that he could bring into a life like somebody like Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex, to help him do what Devereux wanted to achieve. How he actually became that personal private secretary had to do with family connections. So the Walsinghams knew the Sidneys, who knew the Dudleys, who knew and were connected to, and so on. And it was probably because his older brother, Edward Wotton, was at court and had a word with Anthony Bacon, who was connected to Robert Devereux, that then had this move that became this young man, then was put into the service of Robert Devereux and became his secretary. Immediately after that, Devereux then hired 3 more secretaries to do his business. But at that point in Devereux's life, what he was trying to do was to make himself useful to the crown, not so much what he was known for as a great military man, but as a statesman. And to do that, he needed the intelligence, and I'm use that in a double capacity, both the wit, but also the intelligence knowledge of somebody like Wotton to extend a network of information gathering across Europe.
So this network of information gathering sounds a lot like what we think of as the 007 agents, and I wonder exactly what did Henry Wotton do for Robert Devereux? Was he essentially the 007 of the Renaissance? Was he like a special agent for the crown?
He certainly was not 007.
No license to kill.
And his major, what we might think of as spycraft, had to do later with when he was in Venice, when he set up networks there. It was called information. It was called intelligence. It was called spying. But basically what it was doing was trying to put together information to inform policy first before somebody else could give that bit of information that would inform policy. So it wasn't in any way, it was dangerous because for example, if you were, as a Protestant, caught with papers on you as you were traveling and could not say what were in those papers to the satisfaction of the examining magistrate, you could be put in prison. So one traveler advised other travelers always to write what was sensitive, write it in code. But it's all very low level. And what we might think of as deep secrets, probably everybody knew most of the time. But to be an intelligencer, to be an acquirer of intelligence and information, that was an important job. And he did it for Robert Devereux because Robert Devereux needed this information in order to benefit his role inside the Elizabethan government.
Well, Robert Devereux, I guess we could feel a little bad for him because his most well-known moment, I think, is actually in 1601 with the Essex Rebellion. This rocked the nation, and it saw many prominent people in government otherwise tried and hanged for this failed plot against Elizabeth I. And working for Devereux at this time, how was Henry embroiled in this scandal? Did he get tried, or was he cast with suspicion at all for being involved here?
He'd been working with Devereux for the past nearly 5 years. And in that capacity, he served him as a personal private secretary, just doing secretarial work of sending letters, receiving letters, answering things, and so on. But he also, when another explosion happened, when Spain, in reprisal for 1588, decided to launch a second armada, he mobilized, that is, Devereux mobilized against Spain and took a very adventurous raid on Cadiz, to the main harbor of Cadiz. Henry Wotton went with him in this flotilla that attacked Cadiz and eventually sacked Cadiz. He was a warrior alongside Devereux. He then, when Devereux was appointed Lieutenant Governor of Ireland, against Devereux's own wishes, very much hesitantly, Wotton went with him on that campaign in 1599. And it was the disastrous consequences of that campaign in 1599 that led to Essex returning to England, to putting himself in front of the Queen, to being disgraced, to being sent virtually into court exile. Wotton was with him all of this time. Okay, was writing his dispatches and so on. So he was very close with the Earl. And at the moment of this ill-fated, and I always call it the so-called Essex Rebellion, because what Essex thought he was doing was liberating the Queen from really bad advisors. So that march on London in February of 1599 was for him a liberation march. Where was Wotton at this time? Well, we would go back to that big brother at court. By now, he was what we would think of now as kind of the head usher to the crown. I think that he probably saw the writing on the wall, saw what was happening. He got word to his little brother. And in the contemporary biography that's written around the time of his own life, it says basically that he was bundled aboard a boat. He was given money. He was packed off to the continent. He scarpered when the Earl was taken into captivity and was tried and then was executed. So another version of that story says that he was much more involved, but then was sent away to avoid arrest.
So someone let him know to get the heck out of Dodge, as they say around here, of get lost. So because he was out of the country when that all actually went down, he managed to avoid getting any, haven't taken to court over it. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, one of his fellow secretaries was hanged, drawn, and quartered. These 4 secretaries, 2 of them got away. Wotton was absent, and Henry Cuff was hanged, drawn, and quartered.
Well, this sounds like it would be pretty scary to come back to England after this, all went down. But he did, after the aftermath of the rebellion. How did Henry's exile come to the attention of King James VI of Scotland? And how did Henry wind up, I think this is 3 years later, sent to Venice as an English ambassador? So how did that transition take place?
One of the things that I have loved writing about this young man through all the time that I've been doing is the way he's always got one foot on a banana peel and is always just on the verge of total disaster, and then somehow manages to come up smelling of roses. He learns about the execution of Essex when he is now back in Italy and in the court of the Grand Duke of Tuscany. He learns about it. He is overwhelmed with rage and grief at the way his master has been betrayed. And he writes via the Grand Duke's secretary to the Grand Duke that he will never go back to England again, and that he is prepared now to serve the Grand Duke, giving the Grand Duke information, and specifically the Grand Duke information about what's going on in England. Okay? So he becomes an exile. He becomes a different kind of informant. He renounces, his citizenship, so to speak, and decides that he's going to commit treason. Well, he's there in and around the court of the Grand Duke, and it so happens that the Grand Duke gets a message. And the message is about the potential assassination of the Scottish king, King James Stuart, known as the Sixth in Scotland. And the assassination of King James was completely overbalance the relationships and the balance of power in Europe. So King James has got this assassination has to be prevented. He needs then to get somebody sent to Scotland with a box of antidotes to prevent the poisoning of this king. The Grand Duke's secretary says, I know just the man. Henry Wotton is assigned the job of taking this box of antidotes, riding up through Germany, up through Denmark, across and then across the North Sea, because of course he can't go through England. And he travels incognito as Ottavio Baldi. When he meets the king, who's deeply suspicious of foreigners and of assassinations, is well guarded. And Ottavio Baldi steps forward and says, actually, I'm Henry Wotton. I'm a countryman and I've got important information. The king is so delighted with this whole theatrical event that he allows Wotton to stay as Ottavio Baldi in his court for 3 months in disguise and so on before he goes back to Italy. Only months later, then, James VI of Scotland becomes James I of England. Elizabeth dies in March of 1603. And at that point, James comes down from Scotland. He's kept in place all of Elizabeth's household. And he says to Edward Wotton, by the way, do you know somebody called Henry Wotton? And Edward goes, oh, he's my little brother. And he says, well, wherever he is, call him home. Call him home. So I believe that Edward does that. At this point, Henry is in Venice and writes a very, 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 I think of it as his first act of diplomacy, letter to Robert Cecil, who is masterminding regime change in England. And this letter then works his restitution with Robert Cecil, allows him to come home. He's embraced by the king, who calls him my honest dissembler, and always writes to him. The king and Wotton from now on always write to him, to each other as Ottavio Baldi. And then within months, the king sends him back to Venice now as ambassador. And that's actually a very counterintuitive idea. We haven't had an ambassador to Venice in 50 years. So setting up a new embassy in Venice with Wotton, who of course by now is completely fluent in Italian and has Alberico Gentili's, book on diplomacy, I imagine, under his arm, he's going to be setting up a completely new way of dealing with not a monarchy as other places in Europe, but a republic.
So what were Wotton's actual duties as ambassador to Venice?
Robert Cecil says you're not going to have much to do out there. We don't have very much to do with those Venetians. And of course, what happens in the next few years that he's there completely blows apart that idea. Basically, the ambassador is there to negotiate trade, to deal with merchants. And the quotidian business, the day-to-day business that he would have to do would be about taxation, about the anchorage tax, about ships, which of course then immediately explodes into the problem of piracy in the Mediterranean. And how do you recognize a merchant ship from a pirate ship? How do you know if you should land a broadside on somebody? And, all the squabbles that emerge out of that become just a mess for international relations. And he does this by going to the Collegio, which is a small body that is deputed inside the larger representation of the Republic, the Senate, to deal with all of the representations that ambassadors bring to them. So he goes in, he makes an oration called an exposizione to the Doge and to 23 other ministers. He talks in Italian, prepared but without notes. Then the Doge asks him questions, and then he answers, and it goes backwards and forwards and so on. And all of what he is doing is taken down verbatim by a secretary who then takes the written version of what has been said next door into the Senate a couple of days later, reads it to the Senate. They then negotiate over that. Then they bring that. So it's a real backwards and forwards kind of slow process of representation, because this is a republic. And it takes Henry Wotton such a long time and constantly breaking the rules, because the Doge can't give him an answer. The Doge is not an executive person in the government. It all has to be done by this long-winded process of negotiation and discussion and representation and so on. But it's because these exposizioni are there verbally given but written down that they're all there in the archive for me to read across 10 years of what else he's doing. That's the quotidian business that he gets up to. More importantly, I suppose, for the drama of his legation, he has to take care of any English travelers to Venice. He has to deal with a very high-profile murder of a merchant, the assassination of a young man who is the son of somebody really important in England at the fencing school in Padua. But most importantly, and really what puts the kibosh to Cecil's idea that we won't have much to do with him, three things happen at the end of 1605. In London, Catholic dissidents finally grow tired of King James's refusal to honor his agreements about tolerance of Catholic faith in England that he made before he was elected. And that leads to what everybody knows as the 5th of November, the gunpowder plot, the plot to blow up Parliament, the king, and the whole royal family, to destroy the royal family. That happens on the 5th of November. In early December, in Venice, Doge Marino Grimani dies. And that means that you have to trundle in the whole long machinery of electing a new Doge. And in Rome, the Pope Paul V, who hasn't been in the chair for very long, decides that he is going to test his power against Venice, who are refusing to hand over to him some priests that he thinks ought to be tried in the Roman court, by issuing basically a fatwa against the city. It's called an interdict. So we have these three things that are happening simultaneously. We also have to remember in all of this, for diplomacy, that it takes 21 days to get a letter from Venice to London. And if it's opened and read on the same day and replied to, 21 days to get that letter back. So the whole process of diplomacy is very slow, and you have to wait a long time before acting. Of course, when explosions like this happen, you have to act very quickly. One of the things that Gentili told his ambassadors, told his student, was that an ambassador must never think outside his instructions. You must wait for instructions. Well, suddenly, Wotton is in the middle of a huge international, global crisis that requires him to work and act very, very, very promptly. The interdict has the effect of excommunicating the entire city, okay? Which means no baptism, no marriage, no extreme unction, no burial. Any child born during the interdict will be a bastard. Venice responds to the Pope's saber rattling and imposition of this interdict by saying to the city, we're going on as normal. We're going to ignore the Pope. And we're not backing down. And Henry Wotton, instead of arguing about piracy, goes into the Collegio and says, we in England know all about excommunication. Our Queen Elizabeth was excommunicated for more than 50 years. What's the value of an excommunication? Un quattrino, tuppence. It doesn't value anything. And so what he does is he begins to pledge to Venice the support, not just the moral support, but also the military support of England. Because what he knows about King James, from having been with him in Scotland for those 3 months, is that there is something that King James resists even more vehemently than war. King James is the great Rex Pacificus. He hates war. He will do anything to avoid war. But what he hates even more is any attack on sovereignty. November the 5th was an attack on sovereignty. James sees, along with Wotton, that what is happening in Venice with the Pope issuing the interdict is an attack on sovereignty. So for more than a year, this whole crisis continues. And it is, I think, on the one hand, it is the defining act, long act of Wotton's legation. It tests him in many ways in proffering this, really irresponsibly proffering this support before he has any agreement from the king that the king will send in the soldiers if they're required. Through this whole process of long negotiation, of course, then all of what we're facing in the interdict is pan-European war. And my argument is that by his actions, this Protestant ambassador in his little Protestant enclave in Venice, what he does is bolstering the Protestant cause against the Pope. He stops the war.
Just in its tracks. No.
Well, I mean, I don't think anything stops in its tracks in Venice, but over this long process of because Spain, of course, decides that it will back the Pope. These whole sets of treaties and negotiations, and will there be an invasion? Will Fuentes come down from Milan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And, Venice is very small. Venice could not go it alone in resisting the Pope. But there is Wotton saying, we can do it. And of course, what is behind all of this for Wotton is not just the saving of the Republic. Wotton thinks that Venice is with that tiny close bit to having its own Protestant revolution, the way we've already had a Protestant revolution in England and across some of the states of Germany. And there is Venice. We're going to get it. Venice is they're going to become Protestants. It's going to be brilliant. And he carries that mission, idea, wish across this whole time. It doesn't happen, but I think that he was absolutely instrumental in all of the machinations, all of the politics that went, and finally brought Rome and Venice back into, we'll give up. That is Rome. We'll give up.
If you enjoy learning about the history of William Shakespeare and you want to go one step further to really experience the history for yourself, then consider joining Experience Shakespeare. This premium tier on Patreon lets you go behind the curtain and get hands-on with your history, trying out games, recipes, and crafts straight from the life of William Shakespeare. All of these activities are ones you can complete at home or in your classroom. And as a special bonus for joining our community of history lovers, you also get access to our exclusive library of virtual tours, animated plays, printable history guides, and special discounts on all the items in That Shakespeare Life shop. If you are ready to go beyond just learning and start experience Shakespeare's history for yourself, then join us today at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife and click on Experience Shakespeare. I'll see you inside. And now, back to the show. Despite his favor with the king and his obvious talents here with diplomacy, Henry does go on to be disgraced somewhat for a single phrase, and the title of Carroll's book borrows from this phrase, but Henry wrote out the definition of an ambassador in a friend's album just before he crossed the Alps en route to his first appointment as ambassador in 1604. Carroll, tell us about this phrase, and what was the reaction when King James heard Wotton's definition 7 years later?
So we need to see him en route to his first embassy. He hasn't even been an ambassador yet, right? I mean, he has no training to be an ambassador. And he stops in Augsburg, which is just before you hit the Brenner Pass. It's in Austria. So you kind of have a couple of days there with friends, I guess. And this friend gives him an album. Actually, it's his visitor's book. And in this visitor's book, he writes this sentence, and I think of it as a kind of future-proofing. And the sentence goes, legatus est, vir bonus, peregre missus, ad metendium republicae causa. Okay, that's it. That's what he writes in the book. We always translate that into English. And the English translation is, the ambassador is an honest man sent to lie abroad for the sake of his country. Now, for us, of course, the lie is a pun. Lie means to be appointed, be stationed, go there, stay there, and so on. But lie also means to tell a lie. So he's saying that the ambassador, and it's wonderful that kind of that honest man and lie put against each other, he's doing something that goes back to his education. He's being a real smart aleck, writing this and writing it in Latin, of course, as you would for any educated recognition. But it's not until about 7 years later that a man who is writing real invective against King James and slandering the king sees this, pulls it out, and reports it globally, to anybody who's listening, in the Latin. And of course, in Latin, mentendium does not translate. It's not a pun. There's no double meaning there. It's to lie. So in the Latin version, an ambassador lies for his country. King James was not pleased when he heard this, because it was just another barb at him to say, "Oh, you sending people, around the world to lie for you." And he required Wotton to write 2 letters of apology. And one of the letters of apology, of course, simply outed this man for who he was and what he was doing and so on. So it became actually his own little brand of invective and his revenge. And eventually, of course, he was forgiven and he went on to other things. And I think that's because from the first time King James met him in Scotland, and then through all of reading his dispatches from Venice, the king really liked Wotton. He wrote to him once that he received no other ambassador's papers and read them with such great contentment, not just because he gave them political information, but because he was witty. He gave them the gossip. He gave London insights into people and places. He really had his pulse on events and people. And I think King James forgave him because he liked him as much as anything, as indeed Leonardo Donat really, really enjoyed Henry Wotton as an ambassador. So he got away with a lot, I think.
So he built up a lot of clout so that when this moment came where he was called into question, he had a lot to trade with in terms of respect and trust from the king, I think.
Yes. And this wasn't the only time that he got into hot water. I mean, the whole business about the league that he was proposing between England and Venice against the Pope, that got into him to real hot water that he suffered from. It took him a long time to recover from that faux pas, even though it was probably Robert Cecil, the great, manipulator, who was responsible for misinforming both the king and Wotton about what was going on. Anyway, but he was not averse to taking risks, partly because of the 21 days there, 21 days back, time lag. So he took risks. He frequently encountered controversy. He frequently flouted the rules in Venice and just pretended that he hadn't heard anything or turned a blind eye to something. And that's why I think of him as this kind of wonderful maverick who was at the same time quite endearing. It wasn't so much, I think, clout that he had. I think he had probably what we would think of as charisma. And remember, he spoke beautiful Italian.
Well, after he lived this extraordinarily tumultuous life with all of the ups and downs of diplomacy across Europe here, how did Wotton pass the final years of his life?
His first legation ended in December of 1610. He then traveled home across Europe in 1611, stopping along the way and looking at Europe along the way. Spent some time back in London, well, first of all, just debriefing. But then he went on other missions for the crown to try to organize a marriage contract in Savoy. He sat in the parliament for several years. He went on 2 further ambassadorial legations to Venice from 1622 to 1623. He went back to London in 1623 after that 3rd appointment to Venice. At that point, the king then nominated him and appointed him to be provost of Eton College in Windsor. So from 1624 to the time of his death in 1639, he was the provost of Eton College and sat in that college that he called both a theatre and a studium. One of the trophies that he'd brought back from Venice after that first appointment was a wall-sized map of Venice, a full, which is still at Eton College. You can still see it or see it online. This gorgeous map that had gondolas going down the Grand Canal. It had the basilica. It had the piazza. It had women in the marketplace. It had a mountebank. It had a dog bar. It was beautiful. But he had Venice then on his wall for all that time that he was there as the provost, helping young boys learn Latin, helping them acquire the kind of education that would set them on the same path that he had taken so many years ago. He's buried in the chapel at Windsor, at Eton. His marble monument there doesn't contain his name. It isn't inscribed with his name. It has very enigmatically, it has a Latin tag, and then it says, "Seek for me elsewhere. Seek for me elsewhere."
Oh, that's poetic.
It is, but it also, for me, affords the last line of my book, which is to say, Henry Wotton is lying abroad.
Oh, indeed.
Thank you, Henry Wotton.
Well, I know that Shakespeare and Wotton they overlapped in terms of being contemporaries. Obviously, Wotton outlived Shakespeare by a great deal, but they were both, essentially small town boys who eventually lived, grander lives in London. Do we know whether or not they ever met or were in the same spaces at the same time?
Yeah, well, one of the things I'd like your listeners to know is how young all these men were. Shakespeare born 1664, Henry Wotton born 1668, the Earl of Essex born 1665, James, King of Scotland, born 1566, that these were all men of sort of the same decade. We always see them in portraits and they all look like old men. And all of these young men had been living their entire lives as Elizabethans under this aging queen. With King James on the throne, they were suddenly in a court that was full of young people. Okay, so I just like to think about that for a moment. But I don't know whether he and Shakespeare ever met, but I do know that there were 3 times that their paths could have crossed. One was in March of 1599, when Devereux, with his secretary, was riding out of London from Seething Lane all the way across London to go up the Great North Road en route to his appointment as Lieutenant Governor of Ireland. That was March of 1599. The crowds were out. People adored what they called the Star of England, which is, of course, Shakespeare's phrase. Shakespeare was living in Bishopsgate at that point. Was he part of that crowd that gazed out of windows like he has in Coriolanus, when he has all of those people gaping at Coriolanus coming home from the rooftops and so on? Was he there amongst that crowd? Maybe. We do know that he celebrated Essex and in the epilogue to Henry V, when he refers to our general coming glorious home from Ireland with victory on his sword, which of course didn't happen. Essex, of course, was dead by February of 1601. A second time their paths might have crossed was in February of 1601, when a couple of Essex supporters went across the river to the Globe Playhouse and asked the Chamberlain's men to perform an old play, Richard II. That play was by William Shakespeare. Was Shakespeare in the theater that day? We know that Henry Wotton didn't go with that group. He wasn't there. But there could have been a moment when their paths crossed. And then finally, in June 1613, the only reason that we know so fully about this event is because Henry Wotton wrote to his nephew something that had happened on the Bankside this day. And he writes about a play that is going on. And there's a device in this play. There's a mask at Cardinal Wolsey's house. And in this mask, there's a device to set off a cannon. So the cannon is set off, and the wadding of this cannon sticks in the thatch of the Globe Playhouse. But everybody is so intent on what is going on stage that nobody notices that the thatch has caught fire. It has run around the whole building like a train, and the Globe Playhouse burns to the ground in 1 hour. There are no casualties. One man's breeches are set on fire, but he cunningly douses his own breeches with a bottle of ale. Wotton doesn't seem to notice that all of the company's playbooks and costumes might have gone up in smoke. But what he's talking about there is the burning down of Shakespeare's theater during a performance of Shakespeare's play, a new play called All Is True, or Henry VIII, and that Shakespeare very likely was in the playhouse on that day. That's how we know about it, because again, this wonderful crossover of these two lives that maybe never met, but certainly might have. On the day that Wotton was traveling to Venice to take up that appointment, King James in Whitehall, this is in October of 1604, King James in Whitehall was sitting down to watch a new play by William Shakespeare called Othello, or The Moor of Venice.
That's so exciting to me that they were just all right there. And I feel like I want to thank Henry Wotton for his letter to his nephew, because there's just so much history about Shakespeare that we know because he took the time to write that down. That's fascinating. And I know we're excited to know more about Henry Wotton just from what you've told us here. Obviously, we want to go and read your book as our first port of call in discovering more about his life. But if we're new to this branch of history, what can you share with us from the research you've done into his life as some good places to start if we'd like to know more, both about him as well as about diplomacy for England and their international relations during this time?
So I think that there are two really excellent new books out. Claire Jackson's The Mirror of Great Britain, which is a new biography of Henry VI, stroke one, and Lucy Hughes Hallett's book, The Scapegoat, which is sort of my book might be a prequel to Lucy Hughes Hallett's book, because it tells of the short but glorious life of George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham. As it happens, Wotton is one of the people who writes a contemporary biography of George Villiers and compares George Villiers to the Earl of Essex. So Hughes Hallett is able to use Wotton to tell this story of something that is happening just a little bit after the story that I'm telling. And of course, Claire Jackson's book then reframes the whole history of the king under she doesn't tell her story chronologically, she tells her story thematically. But if you want to know about Venice and all of what is going on in Venice, then the absolute definitive book that you need to read is Filippo de Vivo, a book called Communication and Information in Venice.
We will place a link to these books and resources in the show notes today, and I will recommend again that you start your investigation into the life of Henry Wotton with Carol's latest book titled Lying Abroad, Henry Wotton and the Invention of Diplomacy. It's available now wherever major books are sold, and we will have links directly to it in the show notes for today, so make sure you stay tuned for the URL for where to find that. Now, Carol, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Yes, of course, I would like the King James Bible, which is made by King James at the time that Henry Wotton is in Venice. I thought about this a lot, and I think probably I would like a copy of Dante's The Divine Comedy, La Divina Commedia, because it takes me from heaven to hell and back again. It would also help me continue to improve my Italian. When I started on this project of Henry Wotton in the Archivio di Stato in Venice, I had 3 words of Italian. I'm better now, but reading the Divina Commedia would certainly improve my Italian. But I would want it in a particular edition that has, it's a beautiful translation that has the Italian on one side and the English translation on the other.
I think these are excellent choices. And I love that you've blended it all together. It all works very well together too, I think. So, and absolutely, the 1611 version of the King James Bible, we could be specific about that as well.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. What's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
This takes me back into the collegio. You remember that I said that all of these verbal exposizioni were being written down by a secretary verbatim, to be taken into the sentence. The man who was assigned to take care of Wotton in the collegio was a very high-ranking civil servant called Giovanni Carlo Scaramelli. And he already had a history in England because while there was no ambassador exchange, Scaramelli was sent by the Republic to England to protest piracy with Queen Elizabeth. He arrived in London with his protest in February of 1603. And as you remember, the Queen died in March. When she died, poor old Scaramelli was stuck. He was marooned because he had no license to depart. It's a little bit like at the end of Hamlet, when those Gormless ambassadors come from England to say Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead. And then they turn around and say, oh my God, wait a second, everybody's dead here. Who's going to give us our thanks? And who is going to license us our return? And so, like poor old Scaramelli, they are stuck until they can get somebody to agree to allow them to go home. For Scaramelli, he's in London now for nearly a year. Okay? Waiting for somebody to replace him. And he's diligent. He writes every week to Venice. He writes 2 dispatches, one giving the kind of the big news and then giving the gossip. Those dispatches survive. They're in the Archivio di Stato in Venice. And what I'm doing at the moment, what I want to do is to take that portfolio of letters, there are about 300 pages of these letters, that document regime change through that whole year of Elizabeth dying. And when he meets her the first time, he describes her, he speaks with her, he recounts what they taught. She looks at what she looked like and what she said to him. And then all of that business about the mourning and the death and who was the mourners and then the coming of the king and what he did and all these Scots who were arriving and how people feel about it. It's absolutely brilliant as a snapshot of regime change in a very powerful monarchy in England. So that's what I'm doing. I'm collecting those. I'm going to transcribe them, translate them, and then tell the story of this secretary who stood as secretary to the secretary.
That just sounds fantastic. What an exciting first-person account of exactly what was going on in that moment. Can't wait to see that project come to life. Thank you so much, Carol Chillington-Rudder, for joining us today to tell us about this remarkable man, Henry Wotton, and his unique impact on not only the life of William Shakespeare, but diplomacy for the world, it seems, since then. It's been fun learning about him with you today.
Thank you for having me. It's been a delight.
To see more history related to Henry Wotton and to learn more about our guest, Carol Chillington-Rudder, you can find clickable links organized helpfully for you inside our show notes for today. All of these things are on the podcast page at CassidyCash.com/episode 407. Remember, while you're there, if you want to access that bonus content where you can see visual history related to our conversation, click Access the Extras. You can log in as a member of That Shakespeare Life and open all the in-depth history content that goes along with today's show. Again, that's CassidyCash.com/episode 407. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. Until next time, may your travels be strategic, your words artful, and your friendships as smooth and well-kept as the alliances of a skilled diplomat. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.